The story of history is the story of invasions. One group of people moving into someone else's land and taking it. One nation ends, another begins. Invasions drive history. Few Americans understand this is happening to them right now. The United States of America is being invaded.
For the love of God, this is an invasion. Who is allowing this?
They invaded our privacy.
I think it's an invasion of the country.
In other words, it's ending. The country you grew up in no longer exists. Soon it will be unrecognizable. No one is fighting back. Few are even acknowledging it. And the people who lead us are letting it happen. Why are our leaders letting this happen? Well, to destroy the country and to change the demographics. Who lives here determines what the country's like. This country is changing faster than you may understand. Americans are being replaced. That's not a conspiracy theory, it's a fact. In August of 2023, illegal immigration outpaced American births, a brand new population. Last year alone, over 3 million people came here illegally just over our southern border. The media won't tell you it's happening, but if you look around, you can see it, and you can see it most clearly in our cities, which are collapsing. We elect people to protect us. That's what politicians are paid to do. But they've done the opposite. They've sold us out, and they've crushed what our ancestors built. Take a look at our cities. They're hellish, and immigration is the reason. The city of Chicago was in tough shape even before Joe Biden opened the borders. Now, parts of it are basically uninhabitable. Even the socialist mayor of Chicago says the city is breaking under the strain.
Without real significant investment from our federal government, it won't just be the city of Chicago that won't be able to maintain this mission. It's the entire country that is now at stake.
Chicago's politicians may complain about illegal immigration in public, but in private, they're paying for it with your money. They're spending more on illegal aliens than on their own citizens. They're doing this secretly. They're hiding it from the public. Our team uncovered a shadow terminal, for example, inside Chicago O'Hare Airport. Hundreds of migrants were being hidden there secretly. Our team pulled up with cameras rolling, and at first we didn't see much. The city erected a black tarp to hide what was going on. The motive was simple. They didn't want us to see it. And a third-party security group paid for with your tax dollars told us that was prohibited. We weren't allowed to see.
What are you doing?
I want to look inside.
For what? For what?
They weren't local or federal law enforcement, so we ignored them. They had no authority. They were rent-a-cops. Inside, our team found more than 100 beds on the floor. The smell was overpowering, repulsive. It was filthy. But it's not just airport terminals that have been given over to people who've come here illegally from the poorest countries in the world, without permission, criminally, and yet being supported in every detail of their lives by taxpayers. No, even police stations in Chicago have been turned into refugee camps. This is new video never seen before of what's actually happening inside Chicago's police stations. Keep in mind, the people who work in those police stations are paid to protect you, but that's not what they're doing. They're running refugee camps for illegal aliens. As our cameramen approached the Chicago police precinct in the city's downtown to see what was happening inside, you see people come out, illegal aliens, shooting them the middle finger and yelling. They didn't hide their hostility. If you've been following any of the stories over the past several years about the movement of hundreds of thousands, millions of people illegally into the United States, you may have come across the phrase Darien Gap, and it's never really explained what it is. It's a physical place. It's between Panama and Colombia, and it is a gap in the Pan American Highway. In other words, if you want to get from South America to North America overland, you have to go through the Darien Gap, but it's very difficult. And yet, last year, at least 520,000 migrants crossed it to come here. How did that happen? What is it? What is going on in the Darien Gap? It's the key, in some ways, to this story, this immigration story. Well, almost no one has taken the time to go to the Darien Gap and find out what's happening there. Leave it to a world-renowned biologist to do that, not a journalist, a biologist. That would be Dr. Brett Weinstein. A little more precisely, tell us what it is.
Sure, you did a pretty good job. The Pan American Highway is a road that literally goes from Prudhoe Bay, Alaska to the southern tip of South America. It is unbroken, but for a 60-mile stretch between Panama and Colombia. It is not a canyon, as many people imagine the gap must be. It's an impenetrable piece of jungle, and the road has never been completed there, not because it's technically impossible to do, but because the combination of the difficulty of putting a road through that jungle and the danger of doing so has meant that North and South America have been separated in this way for the entire history of that road.
So you often hear people say it's a perilous journey to get across that 60 miles of the Darien Gap. Is that a fair assessment?
It's beyond fair. Let's just say I did my graduate work not far from Darien. I did it in central Panama. And the jungle in the Darien Gap is someplace that one does not go without careful preparation. It is quite dangerous. It involves a number of conditions that make it perilous. For one thing, the Cordillera, which is the mountain range that is effectively the continental divide, the same continental divide that we see in Colorado, for example, continues down through Central America, and it passes through Darien. So imagine a very difficult jungle without proper trails through it, in which migrants have to come up that mountain range, and they're almost all unprepared. They don't have the kinds of materials you would want with you, so they're soaking wet from rain, they're sleeping on the ground, and so they get hypothermia. It's extremely slippery, so people are constantly sliding down hills, breaking limbs. They sleep in their shoes and get trench foot. It's a very treacherous journey, and the difficulty of it should not be underrated.
So you wonder why there's not a permanent team of New York Times reporters there trying to tell the rest of us what exactly is happening. 500,000 people moved through there in 1 year. How did you wind up there?
Well, I wound up there because Michael Yon had been sending me materials, thinking that I would be interested in what was taking place in Panama. And of course, I was utterly fascinated by what I was seeing. Now, some of your viewers may not know Michael. Michael is a former Green Beret who has refashioned himself. Well, the last time I was on your program, I talked about Goliath.
Yes.
And if there's a Goliath, there's a David, and I would argue that Michael Yon is like David's eyes. He's been traversing the world trying to understand a story that as yet has no name, and that story is partially in the Darien of Panama, and it's all sorts of other places, including in various UN installations. There's some story that is difficult to piece together, and he's been physically traveling to all of its various epicenters and showing people.
And that is the story of mass migration.
Mass migration, I now think, is a piece of it. Now, when I went to Panama, I had a hard time explaining to myself why I was going, because
those are the best trips, aren't they?
Yes,
they are.
The serendipity of it is important, but it was hard for me to justify in my head going to such a place when it wasn't going to change. You know, the videos he had sent me were quite clear. So what was it I was going to learn by standing there that I couldn't also learn by looking at these things? Well, I'm very glad I went, because it did actually radically change my understanding of what I was looking at for reasons I better understand now. One needs to see the physical relationship between the various sites that he showed us in order to really piece together what this story is.
So you went, if I can summarize what I think you're saying, because you're a researcher and you wanted to know what's actually happening.
The thing that gets de-emphasized when we talk about high-quality science is the degree to which it is informed by well-tutored intuition. So I had a sense that I needed to see it for reasons that my conscious mind wasn't certain of at the time, and I followed that, and I'm very glad I did.
Follow your instincts, boy. That is the lesson of so many moments in life. So what did you find, and what did you conclude?
Well, I concluded a number of things, and the whole thing was so mentally disruptive that I'm still in the process of unpacking what it was and debating with myself about what it means. But I'll give you some basics. But I do have to ask something of your audience. There's part of this that is just me reporting what I saw and what I learned from Michael and others on our trip. And there's part of it that's me speculating, and I'm trying to do it as responsibly as possible, because a great deal hinges on what the actual explanation for what we looked at is. So when I'm speculating, I'm going to be careful to tell you that that's what I'm doing, and people should, treat hypotheses as hypotheses and nothing more. But the first place that this trip really changed my understanding was I went down thinking that I was going to see a migration. And other people have called it an invasion. And there's something troubling to me about the tension between these two things. I mean, which is it? And I came away with the sense that it's probably literally both. And the way that manifests is you have a massive movement of people through the Darien from Colombia. Now, I did not know when I went down. I now know that most of those people actually start in Ecuador. And the reason they start in Ecuador is that Ecuador has a policy where they don't require a visa. So people coming from all over the world can land in Quito, Ecuador, find their way through Colombia, move through the Darien, and if they survive it, which not all of them do, they can then get relatively directly all the way through Central America into the US. But that's not all that's going on. So we went to several of the, I guess you would call them, transit camps. These are places where people who have come by whatever route to Darien, where they recover if they're injured, and they have to accumulate money, because even if they set out on their journey with enough money to buy a bus ticket to get them through Central America, by the time they've come through Darien, almost all of them have been robbed. And much worse, actually. People are being robbed, women are being raped, and lots of people are dying. The migrants talk about stepping over bodies in Darien, and for somebody with experience in these kinds of jungles, it's not hard to see how, without a support network, the kinds of stuff that can happen in a jungle can become deadly very quickly. Things can spiral out of control. So you have all of these migrants from all over the world. Many of them are South American, but that is by no means the whole story. People are coming from the Middle East. We met Afghans, we met people from the Caribbean, Haitians, there are people from Yemen, Iran. It's shocking, really. This looks superficially like the migration of Central Americans that you and I remember from when we were kids.
Yes.
And there is some of that, but that's not the whole story. Now, there's a camp we went to called Canán Membrillo. It's on the Canán River at the town of Membrillo. And Canán Membrillo, we were allowed to walk around at will, and we could interact with the migrants at will. We were allowed to take pictures. There was no concern about this. We just had to check in with the Senafront. The Senafront is the Panamanian Border Authority. But once we had checked in, we were on our own, and people were interested in talking, including migrants. So we had many conversations with migrants. And these migrants, I have to tell you, when they come to the southern border of the US, they get through on the basis that they are political refugees. They aren't. When we talk to them in the transit camp, everybody tells the same story. They are fleeing economic collapse, and they are fleeing in the direction of what they perceive to be economic opportunity. And of course, in American law, these two things are very different. We protect people who are seeking political asylum, but we do not offer automatic economic asylum. And the reason for that is fairly clear, which is that in order to protect people economically, we end up robbing Americans of their economic well-being. And that's just not something that people are entitled to, no matter how much compassion you may have for people fleeing Venezuela. It is not our responsibility, especially not without some sort of a plan, an agreement about how many people are going to come through and in what way we're going to take care of them and how that's going to get paid for. We don't do that. But in any case, you get the same story from everybody. They're fleeing an economic crisis, and they're moving north, and many of them have terrible stories about what happened to them in the Darien Gap. So that's one thing. And you see, when you go into this camp, Canán Membrillo, you see the hallmark of the international community. You see NGO emblems all over the place, proudly American flags. They've paid for the water system, the toilets that are there. The United States government is facilitating this economic migration, and it's unmistakable, as is an organization called the IOM, which is the International Organization for Migration. It's a branch of the UN. And if you read their charter, you will discover that this organization believes that migration is an inherently good thing, that it's always good. And so they see it as their job to bring it about, to facilitate it. And in this case, that's particularly tragic, because their desire to induce people to migrate is causing people who are woefully unprepared for the Darien Gap to try to make that journey. And the humanitarian tragedy is immense.
So the UN, of which the United States is, I think, the largest donor by far, is paying for this with the U.S. government.
Yep, apparently they are. Now, Panamanians are largely unaware. Some are aware that there's a migration, but in large measure, this migration, once it gets through the Darien Gap, boards buses, and effectively what I now understand is that all of the countries in Central America are effectively waving the migrants through because those migrants are not going to stop in these countries. As long as they keep going to the US, these countries are willing to remain silent about it. Now, in 1991, Heather and I actually traveled the other direction through Central America, through all of the countries south to Costa Rica. And all of those borders are tightly controlled.
Oh, I've been, yeah.
And so it is very surprising to find those controls are effectively lifted here. That's clearly the result of a massive coordination. And of course, it's resulting in a large migration. But what I was going to tell you about the fact that this migration doesn't appear to me to be just one thing is that we went to another camp called San Vicente. And everything in San Vicente is different than it was at Canán Mombrío. San Vicente, first of all, it's not a town. This is a camp that is built as a transit camp. It's built of containers and various objects to house people. And it is almost entirely Chinese. Now, there were Chinese folks. Chinese.
That's a long way from China.
It sure is. And what's more, in this camp, the rule that you're able to go in and walk around and talk to people is not in evidence. The Senafront, the Panamanian border control, actually forbid us to go into the camp. So we had to stay on the outside of it. We were also forbidden to photograph it. So what photographs we have were taken covertly. But the most striking thing...
Wait, may I ask, so is it the government of China, do you believe, that's funding this?
Well, let me tell you the other thing I found, and then I think the answer to that will become clearer. Outside of the San Vicente camp, the Chinese migrants are, you can interact with them. There are a couple of shops where they go to buy water or snacks or whatever. And so you can interact with them at those places. They are the opposite of forthcoming. They have no interest in talking to outsiders. And I've been to dangerous places before. I've been to places where people fear their government and can't talk to you because they feel it's not safe. This didn't feel like that at all. This felt like people who did not want to share information because it would be a mistake to do.